The views expressed in this podcast are solely our own. This information is provided for your convenience. It does not constitute legal advice, nor does it create an attorney-client relationship. Prior results do not guarantee similar outcomes. This is attorney advertising. Enjoy. Hi, welcome again to Red Flags Rising. My name is Mike Hunnicky. I'm a partner at Morgan, Lewis & Bacchius, LLP, in their International Trade and National Security Practice Group. Today is Friday, June 19th, 2026, just after 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern. With me, as always, is my great friend and the founder and Chief Solutions Officer of Red Flags Rising Solutions, LLC, Brent Carlson. Brent, how are you doing today?
Excellent, Mike. Great to be back here talking to some important developments that are going through the export controls world and the world of geopolitics that drives it.
Absolutely, Brent. And this is a bit of a retake on our part. We thought we had the AI diffusion topic mastered a few weeks ago, and it turns out we didn't. There were some developments the day of recording that we decided needed to be updated. And then, frankly, we just decided enough had happened in the past 2 weeks to do a reset, take a fresh look, if you will, at the topic of the AI diffusion rule. Is it dead? Is it alive? What happened to the intent to rescind that was announced previously, and where are we today?
And what this shows in these latest developments over the AI diffusion rule and that guidance that came out of BIS on May 31st is that there is a lot of movement going on in the backfield. There is a lot of pressure that's building in Congress for action. In the world of geopolitics, that's all moving around there too. All these factors together are creating a perfect storm where we're going to see a lot more in the export controls world, not even on the horizon, but imminently.
Absolutely. So we've got actions in Congress, lots to talk about there. I think 22 individual bills were voted out of committee in the House not that long ago to join several other key pieces of legislation that were already pending before one House or the other. These laws could dramatically increase penalties. They could increase the statute of limitations. They could require certain controls on certain items. Lots to unpack there. And then, Brent, we had new guidance from BIS on a Sunday, May 31st, related to the AI diffusion rule. And then we had an is-informed letter issued to a major AI company on June 12th. There's just a lot of different things going on here. As you've said many times quite well, Brent, you have geopolitical pressures affecting national political pressures, driving enforcement priorities for the regulators. We're seeing all of that play out right in front of us in real time. Brent, why don't we unpack these developments? And maybe let's start with the legislative activity, because to me, part of the value proposition of compliance is determined by the potential fines, the potential consequences of non-compliance. Many of these laws would impact that. So what do we see in the recent bills that were enacted and some other pieces of legislation out there?
Yeah, you bet. So these all cleared the House Foreign Affairs Committee. They may be taken up for a vote or maybe included in the National Defense Authorization Act this year. So we might see them come through before the end of the year. There's some big changes coming down the road that, again, reinforce the message that there's a lot of focus on export controls in strengthening them, making them more effective, and quite honestly, giving more tools for enforcement. Right off the top, there's one where maximum penalties would be increased to 4 times the value of the transactions, or $1.2 million per violation, whichever is greater. Currently, it's twice the value of the transaction, so that can add up very quickly. There's another bill that increases the statute of limitations for export control violations up to 10 years. And then another bill that creates a dedicated export controls whistleblower program. So we're seeing a lot more tools and firepower that's going to be added to the export controls enforcement side.
Brent, with some very high-profile prosecutions being unsealed recently and very high-profile defendants being arrested, members of Congress have already pointed to those indictments and those arrests as support for the bills that they're championing and for Congress to take some action. So certainly, at least in the current environment, we expect that Congress will continue to be pushing on this legislation.
These were overwhelmingly bipartisan in terms of the support. Some of these were like 44-0. The most contested one was 36-8. So it's like these things are not real items of contention. If you go back to the Senate side, you can see Senators Warren and Banks or Senator Cotton all joining together for this message. One of the themes here that's reflected in this strong bipartisan support across both the House and the Senate is you see a lot of people that are frustrated with export controls and the perception that they haven't been as effective as they should be. Now you're seeing people looking for solutions. It's important to kind of look at where things are at. On the administrative side, BIS is really looking to find its footing. There has been pressure on BIS to step things up for a very long time. Of course, there's going to be some disruption in any organization when it's looking to regain its footing on whatever mission it's on. But then look at what's happening on the enforcement side, and you can see a steady uptake. In 2024, there were $16 million in enforcement penalties. Compared to 2025, you see 324. A lot of those cases were carried over from the prior administration to the current administration. It's not like the current administration came in and then dropped these cases. Again, look at the signals coming from BIS. It's less in these long, complex rules and more on enforcement actions. So I think it's very important to be reading those settlement agreements in these enforcement actions because that is where the signals from BIS are going to be coming from.
Absolutely. And look, David Peters is a former DOJ prosecutor. He's going to be speaking through his charging. He's going to be speaking through the decisions that they bring. I think that's the ball to keep your eye on.
What's really in focus here are data centers and AI broadly, because AI runs on data centers. The crux of this thing is not just that, the future of modern warfare revolves around AI and how that's going to be manifested in drones and in cyber weapons and developing biological weapons, you name it. It's not the future of warfare, it's the here and now. That's why this stuff is really accelerating and there's a lot of focus on it. Let's talk about that May 31st rule and how that reflects back from the AI diffusion rule, and then talk about the is informed letter that was sent just last week. I think this kind of shows some of the trends that are going on.
Look, there's been a lot of effort by the administration, as we've talked about in the pod, to promote the export of the American AI stack and to help companies really place American technology and American designed items with allies and countries that are key to the current geopolitical competition that's going on. A very important development in this respect at the end of the last administration was the AI diffusion rule. We've talked about that in detail in an earlier podcast from last year. That rule rather ambitiously didn't entirely scrap the prior controls, far from it. It tried to really meld them into what was essentially a global rationing system, very similar to what the Allied powers ended up doing in World War I when they got frustrated and realized that ship by ship end user verifications for coal and other inputs for steel were not really that effective, and they were relying on self-certification. So what good were they anyway? Instead, they knew what the level of steel related imports into the Netherlands and Switzerland, who were neutral in that war, were pre-war, and they felt comfortable that if at least they could keep Germany's wartime production capped at what it was at pre-war, that still would have a very significant and material impact on the German war machine, and it did. So here they try to create that essentially for the diffusion of AI technology through a three-tiered system of countries that would allocate TPP, or total processing power. This global rationing system was roundly criticized by the incoming administration. The key deadline was that although the rule, when announced by the Biden administration, was an interim final rule with immediate effect, it delayed any compliance requirement or expectation until May 15th of 2025. So it was increasing speculation leading up to mid-May of last year. What's going to happen with that rule? Are they going to keep it? Are they going to scrap it? Do I have to comply? How can I comply? How do I calculate TPP? All of these things. On May 13th, by a press release, BIS announced a rescission of the Biden administration's AI diffusion rule while rolling out additional steps to strengthen export controls on semiconductors worldwide. On the one hand, they're getting rid of this global rationing system, but on the other hand, they're announcing guidance and policy documents increasing essentially due diligence expectations. The press release went on to state, the AI diffusion rule was issued on January 15, 2025, with compliance requirements that were set to come into effect on May 15, 2025. These new requirements would have stifled American innovation and saddled companies with burdensome new regulatory requirements. The AI diffusion rule also would have undermined U.S. diplomatic relations with dozens of countries by downgrading them to second-tier status. Obviously, what we've seen since has been a prioritization of exports to the United Arab Emirates and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in particular. Both of those countries would not have been top-tier countries under the Biden-era diffusion rule. In the third paragraph, it said, BIS plans to publish a regulation formalizing the rescission and will issue a replacement rule in the future. Under Secretary of Commerce for Industry and Security, Jeffrey Kessler has instructed BIS enforcement officials not to enforce the Biden administration's AI diffusion rules, stating the Trump administration will pursue a bold, inclusive strategy to American AI technology with trusted foreign countries around the world while keeping the technology out of the hands of our adversaries. At the same time, we reject the Biden administration's attempt to impose its own ill-conceived and counterproductive AI policies on the American people. In the same breath, BIS announced guidance alerting industry to the risks of using PRC advanced computing integrated circuits, specifically mentioning chips from Huawei. It issued guidance warning the public broadly about the potential consequences of allowing US AI chips to be used for training and inference of Chinese AI models. And it issued guidance on how to protect supply chains against diversion tactics, setting out lists of red flags and due diligence questions that companies should be expected to follow and be aware of.
I think where this cuts down to, though, is whether or not there is the requirement, the rule from November 2023. It comes down to basically advanced computing items, the AI chips, and all the electronic assemblies that go around them. These are the 3A090 items and the 4A090 items. Is a license required if we're exporting these items to these PRC companies building data centers outside of the PRC? That's what it comes down to. Where there was confusion here was that the AI diffusion rule moved that November 2023 rule from one part of the EAR to another. There's this confusion over, was this a loophole that allowed these advanced computing items to be sold to these PRC entities globally outside of China? On two different levels, the answer here is no. You see the May 31st guidance say that there always was required, but looking at this, like we've just done right here, that November 2023 rule has always been in force. The AI diffusion rule just moved from one part of the EAR to another. There's the other issue, too, where it's like the AI diffusion rule was never formally rescinded. The Government Accountability Office issued a report just a few weeks ago, just before this all came out, basically coming to that same conclusion, that this rule was never officially rescinded, so these are still laws on the books. That GAO report also reflects that there is congressional scrutiny on all this as well to maintain the effectiveness of export controls. But one thing I think is really interesting in the dialogue that's been going back and forth is people calling these loopholes. I don't think there was a loophole that ever was here. If somebody thought it was a loophole, they're probably going to meet with a liability pitfall, because another thing that I would expect, looking at that May 31st guidance that came out, reiterating that this license requirement was still in place, is enforcement activity.
You know, Brent, when I was thinking about this as we were preparing for this podcast, I think a fundamental maybe gap in some people's thinking around the rescission was that it was affirmatively getting rid of a bunch of things. What it really did was reset the clock back to January 14th, 2026, plus the guidance that was added in May of 2025. And we just went back to that point. So when you talk about a rule being rescinded, and as you said, some of the rule was substantive, some of it was structural. It just reorganized existing requirements without changing them. It just put those back. Now, part of the confusion too is if you were coming to this area of law and regulation new, you might reasonably think, I'm going to go look at the regulations. And those didn't change. I think that was a real challenge for a lot of people. If you're in the moment just trying to pull up online, okay, what's the rule for this? What's the rule for that? There was nothing in the Federal Register that caused the Code of Federal Regulations to be actually updated, to be replaced with a placeholder, to have a flashing red light on them. Anecdotally, when companies then were looking at what would be the expectations for them to receive controlled chips, say in 2027 at a new data center, there was a question like, what is the actual regulation going to be that we have to comply with? In practice, what was really being targeted, and frankly, what they really were saying publicly they did not like, was this global rationing system. If you look at the authorizations for some countries in the Middle East, if you look at the authorizations even for the H200 chips, which the president said he would authorize, and then BIS explained what is that going to look like? What are the license requirements going to be? Those specific expectations really walked and talked a lot like the expectations of the Biden era AI diffusion rule. It just changed who was going to get to be in the top level, who was going to get to the front of the line. But the cybersecurity, physical security, KYC requirements were all there. Some of them even introduced remote access requirements that frankly were inconsistent with how BIS has historically interpreted remote access. Now, another bit of legislation that's still pending is the Remote Access Security Act, which wouldn't require BIS to impose KYC obligations on companies for remote access by customers to their data centers, but it would empower BIS to require a license for that. I was talking to one of my colleagues the other day, and he correctly pointed out if BIS hasn't wanted to find that authority for the last 15 years, why would they jump on the chance to implement rules under a clear grant of authority now? That's a fair question, but who knows? We're living in this world with a lot of things coexisting at the same time that you might not think would coexist, and one of them is this aggressive push to promote American AI exports with this still hard-running vein of serious export controls over frontier AI capabilities. On Sunday, May 31st, in the morning, the Commerce Department issued, very unusually in terms of timing, guidance regarding enforcement of license requirements for advanced computing items for entities headquartered in Country Group D5 in Macau. BIS stated they wanted to clarify that a license is required under that November 2023 rule. This rule was, quote, implemented via an end-user control in Part 744.23A3 of the U.S. export controls and applied to all advanced computing items. In January of 2025, the AI diffusion rule transferred the requirement into Part 742.6 as part of the new worldwide rationing system. BIS points to its announcement in May 2025 that it would not be enforcing the AI diffusion rule's new compliance requirements. Then it said recently BIS has received questions as to whether the pre-existing license requirement established in November 2023 is still being enforced. The answer is yes.
And that's literally what they said. It's like that short and sweet. The answer is yes.
Getting right to the point. Specifically, a license requirement continues to apply to all destinations outside the United States for these advanced computing items when such items are for entities headquartered in or whose ultimate, it's not even direct, but ultimate parent company is headquartered in Country Group D5 or Macau. Because this license requirement predates the AI diffusion rule, BIS's non-enforcement policy with respect to the destination-based license requirements for these advanced computing items applies only to the extent such items are not for entities headquartered in or that have ultimate parent companies headquartered in Country Group D5 or Macau. So, the guidance continues, exporters should continue to seek BIS licenses for such transactions unless a license exception is available. Now, what's then really interesting, Brent, is although they're stating the position that the license requirement always applied and was never under a non-enforcement policy, it was never intended to be rescinded, there's a bit of what you and I have called in the last couple of weeks a General Prohibition 10 savings clause, essentially, that follows in the penultimate paragraph of this guidance. Bona fide operators of data centers who are otherwise engaged in activities consistent with the EAR are not required to cease the ongoing use, storage, disposal, or servicing of advanced computing items because of this guidance until further notice from BIS. Then they have a helpful reminder at the end for information regarding the submission of voluntary self-disclosures, see 764.5 of the EAR, and for guidance on the submission of license applications, just in case you now might need one, see Part 748.
So that just shows enforcement's coming on this. Taking a step back, this reflects the changes in how BIS is operating, how the export controls world is changing, where you had this whole boatload of rules that would come out. You didn't see the enforcement activity. Now we flip that around where you see a dearth of rulemaking coming out, but you're seeing enforcement of existing laws on the books. And I think that's what's really more important. If BIS had to get this guidance out on a Sunday, that means something somewhere is a snafu. And so they needed to jump on it. I would expect you're going to see enforcement activity coming out of this. If people thought that November 2023 rule got canceled, no way.
The other thing that we don't know is whether there was some shipment coming out the next day that maybe somebody needed commercially under a contract a clear statement from them, and it was important enough that they offered to provide it. It would seem to be a big ask and a big give, given the public scrutiny of it, and the fact that if you look at law firm guidance around the time that the May 2025 announcements were made, people were saying, be careful, the November 2023 advanced computing item controls haven't changed.
That's another point to make, too. Stop calling this a loophole. It's not a loophole. There never was a loophole. Even for the people that are advocating stronger export controls, they're calling it a loophole. It's not a loophole.
It certainly shows enforcement's coming. It's not some announcement of some sort of amnesty program, and people should be clear about that. It is telling you that if you are an operator and you're sitting in a data center and chips that should have been licensed between May 13th, 2025 and May 31st, 2026 are being used, stored, disposed of, or serviced, it looks like they're telling you that you don't have to stop those activities, but you may receive further notice from them. If you were sitting there today trying to rely on that paragraph to just continue business as usual until you're expressly told otherwise, there's a lot of language in just that paragraph that is, let's say, open to interpretation, and the government is very likely to interpret that language differently than might industry. For example, who is a bona fide operator? Well, at one end of the spectrum, surely a fake data center like some that have been named in recent indictments unsealed against individuals would not be bona fide, I think, in anyone's eyes. But is a bona fide operator a subsidiary of a Chinese company? Is a bona fide operator somebody who was set up specifically to sidestep the direct export controls imposed in October of 2022 and October of 2023? BIS might well say no. So there's some ambiguity there. Just moving a few words down in that savings clause, otherwise engaged in activities consistent. They may give you a pass for during that year violating the specific November 2023 controls. But as you and I have pointed out, Brent, in the context of the affiliates rule and other specific focused regulations, none of these things have changed the broader anti-evasion, anti-diversion framework that has existed for years. General Prohibition 10, for example, but also the catch-all provisions, including as to supercomputers. In particular, that would apply likely to many data centers. You need to be able to show you're otherwise compliant with that. And to the extent the November 2023 rule is viewed by BAS as really trying to expressly close a loophole, there's some interpretation that BAS might take of those words that, again, would be different than industry might. Then you're not required to cease certain activities. But when you're talking about ceasing ongoing activities, I think as any business would then immediately ask, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that if I have a master services agreement or a framework agreement under which I'm doing all these different things, can I continue to take on new projects under this overall framework agreement? Can I sign a whole new framework agreement with the same customer? You can very well see, Brent, a lot of companies, again, using the language of this penultimate savings clause, having a lot of operational questions about what does this mean in terms of contracts, purchase orders, invoicing, exports. That's where BIS is hoping you'll come to them and talk to them. I think it would be very risky for anyone just to haphazardly continue business as normal. If you're in a data center, if the November 2023 rules apply to you, it would be very risky to continue business as usual.
Actually looking at this, that paragraph right before the very end, that is an invitation for anyone who may have made a mistake and not fully realized that that November 2023 advanced computing rule was still in effect throughout all this, to come to BIS first before BIS comes to them.
What's important to also understand here is that what this means is that as of June 1st, there's no more excuses. BIS might have issued this because they saw some litigation risk to themselves if they tried to go before an administrative law judge or if someone challenged their interpretation before a district court for that period from May 13th to May 31st. But because this guidance was issued on Sunday, May 31st, as of June 1st, that rule, to the extent it was ever gone, and BIS is saying it was not, snaps back. Immediate impact, immediate effect. So, Brent, there were some other important developments. On Friday, June 12th, in the evening, it was publicly reported that Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick issued an is-informed letter to one of the big AI model developers, essentially shutting down some of their latest models. Why don't you walk us through what happened and what are we thinking about what this means for, frankly, even other companies?
Yeah, so this is another big, I don't want to use tech shock, but it's a big change in the world of export controls. So on Friday, June 12th, Commerce Secretary Lutnick issued his informed letter to this large AI model company that informed them that an export license is required for the export, re-export, transfer in country, including deemed exports and deemed re-exports of their latest models to all destinations worldwide and to all foreign persons, as defined in the EAR. The company then took the immediate step where they took down access to those models. There's been a lot of discussion on this in terms of how BIS is approaching some of these export controls toward implications for cloud computing, software access, and the deemed exports. But one thing I think that was interesting is that the reason given in the letter, it was, quote unquote, there is an unacceptable risk of use in or diversion to a military intelligence end use or military intelligence end user. And really what this comes down to, these AI systems are not at the future of modern warfare, they're the here and now. The key takeaways are that these geopolitical drivers, which drive national security, which drive new laws, regulations, and enforcement priorities, then really have to then push companies to maintain effective compliance programs that are flexible and forward-looking for these things. Because we're now in a situation where these items, these advanced computing items that revolve around the rapidly advancing AI capabilities, cuts right to the core of national security, not just for the United States, but everybody else out there. Your government can come in and just basically shut down an entire business. It could be even existential for your company if you're not fully thinking through and thinking ahead on where the trends are going here. Literally, things can happen overnight, and it can cut right to the company's business, the bottom line, and even the very existence of it.
So Brent, that brings us to this episode's managing up. What is your managing up for today?
Yeah, Mike, the managing up this time around is let's not ignore the gray rhinos. They are there, right on the road. Let's take actions to avoid collision and protect ourselves, protect the company's officers and directors, and ultimately protect shareholder value.
Well said, Brent. So not everyone listening to us might catch the gray rhino reference. It's one you've made in an earlier episode as well. This is a callback to the book, The Gray Rhino, How to Recognize and Act on the Obvious Dangers We Ignore, a seminal business and crisis management book that explores why leaders and organizations frequently ignore massive, highly predictable, and high-impact threats, by Michelle Wucker. We'll include, of course, a link to Michelle's book in the notes.
That's correct. Another big fan of the book reportedly is Chinese leader Xi Jinping. So he's working on his gray rhinos too. We all have those gray rhinos. Let's not let them hit us. Let's not hit them.
Well, Brent, well said as always. That concludes this episode of Red Flags Rising. Thank you to everyone for listening and for all of you dealing with this whipsaw of regulatory change and guidance, providing guidance about prior guidance. Hang in there. You're not alone. There are a community of people dealing with all of the same problems. Feel free to reach out anytime if anyone wants to compare notes or just have either what used to be called a sanity check maybe 5 years ago and now is more of an insanity check. The whole point of this podcast has been to try to offer trade compliance professionals, whether you're in-house, whether you're an external advisor, some principled basis for restoring some sort of order and semblance of normalcy to your lives. We're all running around with their hair caught on fire. Every time there's an unexpected announcement, yes, there are going to be emergencies. There are going to be global events, world events that happen unexpectedly that do cause genuine emergencies. But there's also other ways to manage day-to-day life, to focus your efforts on your greatest risks, and then have a way to defend those decisions later. That's really the fundamental purpose of everything we've been doing with this podcast. So we hope it's been helpful. We're always open to ideas and feedback. Feel free to provide them. You can contact us at our email addresses and websites in the show notes.
Thanks, Mike. And everyone else out there, take care.